Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your daily dose of zombies news from the game and its community here on COD Zombies HQ. Thank you so much for tuning in today, where we now have our first piece of in-game gameplay and evidence for the return of a fan-favorite mode into zombies that the community has been asking Treyarch to bring back since the release of Black Ops 2. So without further ado, let's kick things right off with our first story of the day. Now this story begins before the launch of Vanguard Zombies, where a bunch of developers over at Treyarch did what is now basically a famous interview where they talked about this mode and its future. Well, the very last question that the interviewer asked the Treyarch Zombies devs was about a player versus environment, a PVPVE game mode that existed within Black Ops 2 Zombies called Grief. It put two teams of 4 players against each other to survive out as long as possible. It was still zombies, the players couldn't actually hurt or damage each other, but it was competitive. You're trying to outlast your opponents. Ever since then, players have been wanting Treyarch to bring it back. I've had comments from Treyarch throughout the years saying that they're still working on trying to perfect the mode, to bring it back at the right time.
We've not forgotten about Grief. But I'd also stated that we won't go back to Grief until I was really happy with it. Which is close. Right. It's close.
And in this interview, Treyarch gave us the first hint that the mode would be returning, where a dev at Treyarch, Miles Leslie, said this about the Grief mode: "We can't talk about all the things post-ship, post-release, but I love that you're a fan of that, because again, we have massive lists, and there's a lot of people on the team that love that Grief mode as well. So if it comes back, maybe, but if it doesn't, maybe as well, but it's not forgotten in that sense." And it seems like, as of recent data mined information from new content added into the Vanguard game files as of the latest update, evidence of Grief mode, or at least something like it, returning has been found, where seemingly a prototype or an early version of this Grief mode is in the files and is also playable in some small way. Now the mode is codenamed exactly what we would expect this mode to be codenamed: PVPVE, player versus environment. And when loaded up in Vanguard Zombies, obviously I can't show you the gameplay or Activision would strike me down, but of course there is evidence of this linked down in the description if you want to check it out after this video. When you take down zombies, you don't just take down the zombies, they're counted as team kills. And other times when you do it in quick succession, they're called ultra kills. The design of the HUD in this early Grief mode prototype is also changed compared to the original Darren Fang version, where for whatever reason there's no points counter. And most interestingly, on the bottom right hand side of the screen, where I'll put this rectangle up so you can get an idea of where it is, there is 3 other small little squares that might be indicative of some kind of extra abilities or even possibly some kind of consumable items being added as part of this mode. But with how early in development this version of Grief mode is, there's no absolute way to tell right now. Furthermore, with this mode being added into the files of the game, it is evidence that Treyarch is working on releasing it, but as always with unreleased content, we do have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, where things at Treyarch tend to change rapidly, especially with the response that this game has garnered early in its lifespan. There is always a possibility that plans at Treyarch could change and that development for this Grief game mode could be just stopped. We've been waiting ever since Black Ops 2 for Grief mode to return, and it's very interesting that here in Vanguard is the first actual evidence of it being added into a game. Now, we also don't know how the Grief mode is intended to be played. Originally in Black Ops 2, of course, the Grief mode was played on classic round-based zombies maps like Mob of the Dead, where currently the game mode is only able to be booted up on the only zombies map we have in the game, Der Anfang, but we don't know if Treyarch wants us to play Grief against other players while doing objectives, or if Grief is intended to be played on some kind of future DLC map that they just haven't released yet and only have access to internally right now. But as repetitive and bare bones as the Der Anfang game mode is at launch right now, I will say the addition of some kind of competitive element to this cooperative zombies game mode would be very, very welcome, and I think would go a long way to increase replayability of this mode. It seems like Treyarch may be noticing that the launch of this game mode was extremely underwhelming, and they received massive pushback for it. Might be trying to do right to the zombies community here by adding a bunch of fan favorite content that they just didn't or refused to do in prior games to try to maybe make up for the lackluster state that this game released in. And one of the reasons that Treyarch seems to have shifted to this objective-based form of zombies gameplay in the first place was to try to capitalize on the Warzone audience, to try to make the zombies mode more accessible to that audience, which I personally am not particularly a fan of. Like many of you, I'd much rather have round-based content, but I'd argue another great way to bring in more players into the zombies mode is to add that bit of competitive aspect that you get from Warzone and multiplayer into the zombies mode. By adding competition against other players on top of zombies' cooperative survival element, I think that's kind of like the special ingredient that Zombies has been missing for the last half decade. Now, if they do end up continuing to flesh out and expand and develop this PVPVE grief game mode that has been discovered in the files, is that alone enough to save Vanguard Zombies in the eyes of the community going forward in its DLC season? Well, I think the obvious answer to that is it would go a long way to help improving the reach and replayability of the Vanguard Zombies mode. Obviously, in the eyes of the community, one of the big things Treyarch needs to do to salvage this game mode is the addition of traditional survival zombies map content that we just straight up didn't get at launch in this game. But playing zombies competitively against other players is something the majority of this fan base, I think, the majority of zombies players playing today haven't really experienced, and especially with Black Ops 2 being as old of a game it is, don't have any option or choice to experience it. If they do release Grief in Vanguard, I can't understate how much of a massive deal it is. Especially if it's successful, it could mean that we can see the Grief mode, see competitive zombies returning in Treyarch's next full Black Ops release in 2023. But next up, a new trick has been discovered in Vanguard Zombies that, while is useful right now in the current game mode, would actually be even more useful if Grief mode is actually added into the game. Now, that has to do with the perk fountains in the game that enables you to get the perk instantly instead of having to go through a drinking animation. The way to do it is super easy. All you have to do is melee right as you buy the perk, and it'll skip the animation entirely and instantly give you the effect of upgrading the perk. So if you ever find yourself going down and are just making a trip to all the perk machines to re-up your tier levels instead of being mobbed by zombies while you're in the middle of drinking a perk, simply melee, grab the perk, and get out of there. But that wraps up the news today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider hitting the thumbs up button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. The return of the Grief mode would be massive for zombies, not only in this game, but going into the future. And hopefully with the evidence that the game mode is, at least in part, being worked on, that Treyarch does keep developing it, and we see it fully release into the game sometime soon. But I want to thank you again for watching, and I'll see you with another Zombies news video tomorrow. Peace.